Hello and welcome back. My name is Nathan House and I am with the Church of Christ in Houston, California. And if you could like or subscribe to this video, that'd be appreciated. So last time we introduced the book of Habakkuk, and last time what we saw was there was this dialogue between God and Habakkuk, right? Habakkuk is saying, God, there's a lot of sin in Judah. When are you going to deal with it? God tells Habakkuk, I'm going to deal with it. I'm going to bring the Babylonians. He says here in verse 6, I am raising up the Chaldeans, the Babylonians, and they're going to come and they're going to be my punishment of the people of Judah. Habakkuk does not like this answer. So he makes a second complaint and he says to God, you're going to use a nation that is more wicked to punish Judah? See, he was looking at Judah and saying, yes, there's problems, but Babylon is worse. So how could you use a more wicked nation to punish us? He says, oh Lord, you have ordained them, the Babylonians, as a judgment. How could you do this? So he makes this complaint through the last part of chapter 1. As chapter 1 ends, it comes into chapter 2, and Habakkuk says, I will take my stand, and I'm going to wait to see what you say, God, about my complaint. So there's this dialogue between Habakkuk and God. Habakkuk complains about Judah's wickedness. God says, I'm going to punish them. I'm going to use the Babylonians to punish them. And then Habakkuk complains about God's plan on how he's going to punish Judah. He doesn't like God's plan. So that comes into chapter 2. Let's look at how God now responds to Habakkuk. He's going to tell Habakkuk this: the time is coming when I will deal with Babylon as well. That's going to be his answer. Let's go ahead and look at this, verses 2 through 5. And the Lord answered me, write the vision, make it plain on tablets, so he may run who reads it. For still the vision awaits. So he says it's there's an appointed time that's coming. It hastens to the end. It will not lie. If it seems slow, wait for it. It will come. It will not delay. He's telling Habakkuk, I will deal with Babylon as well. Behold, his soul is puffed up. Talking about Babylon. It is not right within him. But the righteous shall live by faith. So he makes a point here. And this is a significant point, and it applies throughout the New Testament. It applies throughout our life. How does a righteous person live? Paul will quote this in Romans and Galatians. The Hebrew writer quotes this verse 4 in the book of Hebrews. How does a righteous person live? We are to live by faith. We are to live not by what we see. We are to live by the things, the faith that we put in God, the faith that we put in God's promises, the faith that we put in God's timing. So the righteous live in a different way than Babylon does, than the world does. The righteous lives by faith. So how should Habakkuk wait for the punishment? How should Habakkuk deal with the answer that he doesn't like? By putting his faith in the Lord, by trusting in the Lord in his time. Again, it's going to be at God's time. By trusting in the Lord's goodness, by trusting in the Lord's justice. He needs to put his faith in God to do these things. So he tells Habakkuk essentially, wait in faith for these things. Trust in the promises, trust in what I'm telling you, and trust in the timing. And so it's interesting because we see when in the book of Jeremiah, we see God talking about how he will punish Babylon there too. Chapter 51 says, thus says the Lord, behold, I will stir up the spirit of a destroyer against Babylon and the inhabitants of Leb Kamai. And I will send to Babylon winnowers, and they shall winnow her. They shall empty her land when they come against her from every side on the day of trouble. Let's look down here, verse 4. They shall fall down slain in the land of the Chaldeans and wounded in her streets. So God tells Habakkuk, I will punish them. God tells Jeremiah, I'm going to punish Babylon. So then in chapter 2, go back to Habakkuk here, chapter 2, we see five woes that are announced against Babylon, and we'll talk about them more in a minute. But essentially what we see in verses 6 through 20, or at least 6 through 19, is God is laying out the sins of Babylon, how he will punish Babylon. And again, very interesting because, go back here for a second to Jeremiah 51. And again, look at verse 5 and 6. for Israel and Judah have not been forsaken. You see, Habakkuk thought, well, if you're bringing Babylon against Judah, does that mean you have forsaken us? Does that mean you've abandoned us, God? Jeremiah writes, again, for Israel and Judah have not been forsaken by their God, the Lord of hosts. But the land of the Chaldeans, the Babylonians, is full of guilt against the Holy One of Israel. Flee from the midst of Babylon. Let everyone save his life. Be not cut off in her punishment. For this is the time. And again, it's all about God's time. This is the time of the Lord's vengeance, the repayment he is rendering her. And so God tells Habakkuk, he says, I will deal with Babylon. I'm going to deal with Judah. I'm going to punish Judah. Habakkuk doesn't like how God is going to punish Judah. But God assures Habakkuk, Babylon's not going to be found innocent. So we have these, go back to Habakkuk, we have these 5 woes that are announced against the Babylonians. Woe to the Chaldeans. You can see that here in the ESV. He says, shall not all these take up their taunt against him with scoffing and riddles for him and say, woe to him, to Babylon, who heaps up what is not his own. So Babylon was guilty of heaping up and piling up things that didn't belong to them. And again, we see this question, for how long? And kind of interesting because that question, kind of has been a question of Habakkuk's question, right? If you look back here at the beginning of the letter, Habakkuk says, this little minor prophet, Habakkuk says, how long shall I cry for help? So here again, we see this phrase of how long. He says, woe to him who weeps up what is not his own. How long? He loads up himself with pledges. So we see verses 6 through 8, the first woe is, here is the group of the Babylonians. They're heaping up things that don't belong to him. They are covetous. And so their greed has led them to do things by attacking and bringing down other nations. Verses 9 through 11, we see the second woe. They are woe against him who gets evil gain for his house. Again, notice verse 9. Woe to him who gets evil gain for his house. And so we see again that the Babylonians were gaining things through wickedness, through godlessness. We come to the next woe here, verses 12 through 14. It says, woe to him who builds a town with blood. So here, the fourth woe, right? We see this wickedness, their bloodshed, their violence. For the earth will be filled. Actually, back up here. Woe to him who builds a town with blood and founds a city on iniquity. Behold, it is not from the Lord of hosts that people labor merely for fire, and nations weary themselves for nothing. For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the water covers the sea. But he's building, the Babylonians were building their town with bloodshed. Verses 15 through 17. Woe to him who makes his neighbor drink, who you pour out your wrath and make them drunk in order to gaze at their nakedness. You will have your fill of shame instead of glory. Drink yourself and show your uncircumcision. The cup in the Lord's right hand, so the cup of God's wrath, will come around to you, and utter shame will come upon your glory. The violence done to Lebanon will overwhelm you, as will the destruction of the beast that terrified them, for the blood of man and violence to the earth, to cities, to all who dwell on them. So God is going to bring upon them the punishment for their wickedness, for their drunkenness, for their violence, for their covetousness, for their godless behavior. And then we come to what I guess would be considered the fifth woe here, verse 18 and 19. It's organized a little differently. He now pronounces a woe upon those who are guilty of idolatry. So here was this idolatry that they were guilty of. So he announces a woe. I want to go back to Jeremiah chapter 51 for a second. I want you to see something else that's kind of interesting. Babylon was a golden cup in the Lord's hand, making all the earth drunk. The nations drank of her wine, therefore the nations went mad. Babylon was a golden cup. This image reminds me of the book of Revelation. This cup, Babylon. So go back and read the book of Revelation, see some Old Testament imagery there. But Babylon was a golden cup in the Lord's hand, making all the earth drunk, the nations drank. And so then he references this idea here in Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 15. Woe to him who makes his neighbors drink. You pour out your wrath and make them drunk in order to gaze at their nakedness. So we see the violence. And it's interesting because what was Babylon's downfall? You know, when you look at what was the immediate downfall that we see of Babylon in the book of Daniel, chapter 5, it was when the Babylonians got drunk, right? And there was that giant party and the giant hand coming right on the writing on the wall, many, many, tekel upharsin, and God announces his judgment on Babylon, who was having this drunken party. God announces his judgment upon them in Daniel chapter 5. So anyways, it's interesting to see how these images kind of come full circle. So Habakkuk here, 5 woes. The 5th woe, what profit is an idol when its maker has shaped it, a metal image, a teacher of lies? For its maker, look at this, its maker, the one who makes the idol, trusts in his own creation. Again, put this back in context of what does he say back in chapter 2, verse 4 there? The righteous shall live by faith, or his faithfulness, his belief in God. While this person is putting his trust in his own creation. Woe to him who says to a wooden thing, awake, to a silent stone, arise. Can this thing teach? It's overlaid with gold and silver, and there's no breath in it at all. You see, then God contrasts this foolishness, this idea of putting your faith in this wood, this stone, which Babylon was trusting, and he contrasts that with this. This thing is wooden, it's made of stone. It's a speechless idol. It doesn't teach, it has no breath. Look at how how God contrasts this in Habakkuk 2:20. But the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him. Let all the earth keep silence before him. I want to go back to another text in Jeremiah. And instead of chapter 51, we're going to go to chapter 50 for a second and look at verse 34. Look at verse 34. We'll actually go to verse 33. Thus says the Lord of hosts, the people of Israel are oppressed, the people of Judah with them. All who took them captive have held them fast. They refused to let them go. So Israel was, of course, taken captive by the Assyrians, who then fell to the Babylonians. Judah was taken captive by the Babylonians. Verse 34, their Redeemer, the Redeemer of Israel, the Redeemer of Judah, their Redeemer is strong. The Lord of hosts is his name. He will surely plead their cause, that he may give rest to the earth, but unrest to the inhabitants of the Babylonians. A sword against the Chaldeans, declares the Lord, and against the inhabitants of Babylon, and against her officials and her wise men. Verse 36, a sword against the diviners, that they may become fools, a sword against her warriors, that they may be destroyed. Verse 37, a sword against her horses and against her chariots and against all the foreign troops in her midst, that they may become women. A sword against all her treasures, that they may be plundered. A drought against her waters, that they may be dried up. For it is a land of images, and they are mad over idols. And again, all this is in contrast to who God is. God is in his holy temple. So let's come back and try to wrap this up real quickly, examining the question that Habakkuk answered. How can God not get involved, even allow a wicked nation like Babylon to swallow up a nation more righteous? That goes back to chapter 1, verse 13. How can you allow this wicked nation, I'll go back there and I'll just show you. How can you allow this wicked nation to swallow up a land more righteous? You who are purer of eyes than to see evil and cannot look at wrong, why do you idly look at traitors and remain silent when the wicked, Babylon, swallows up the man, Judah, more righteous than he? God, how can you do this? That's his question. That's his complaint. God's answer here in chapter 2, verses 2 through 3, because he asked that question in chapter 1, verse 2. How long, O Lord? Chapter 1, verse 2. How long? God's answer is this. Wait for it. Wait for it. Right? If it seems slow, wait for it. How long, God? How long? God tells Habakkuk, wait for it. God's answer is this. God will punish Judah. God will. It will be in his time, God's time, God will punish Judah. But as for you, Judah, as for you, Habakkuk, live by faith. Chapter 2, verse 4. The righteous will live differently By faith, they were to trust God to intervene. By faith, they were to wait for his timing. He will punish Judah, as he will demonstrate. He will also hold Babylon accountable, which he will show. And so there's a quote from Beale and Carson in their commentary, and they were talking about this faithfulness here. And this was their quote. It says, "The faithfulness of which Habakkuk writes is a faithfulness of the Lord to fulfill the promise of salvation given in his vision," which will come in chapter 3. So a promise to trust in God's fulfillment. Then they continue to live by that faithfulness. Listen to this. To live by that faithfulness is to believe the astounding word of the Lord. You see, they need to be people that live by faith. We put our faith in God. God will do what he has said. God is righteous. Babylon's end is coming. That's part of the answer to Habakkuk's question. But how does this apply to us? How does this apply to us? In contrast to those who were relying on themselves, Babylon was relying on their power, their wealth, their might. In contrast to those who were relying on themselves, those who were arrogant, those who were puffed up, those who rejected the message of God. Look at verse 4, right? His soul is puffed up. It is not upright. In contrast to that, the righteous live by faith in the promises of God. Chapter 2, verse 4. Trusting God that he's going to do as he promised. Trusting God that he will do it in his time, his appointed time. That he will work in his method. We want God too many times to work in our time frame, how we want God to work. But we need to be people that live by faith. That means that we need to live in full confidence of the righteousness of God, of the promise of God, trusting in his time, trusting in his method to do what is right. Anyway, so that is our lesson today, our study today. Next time we'll finish the book of Habakkuk. And so anyways, thank you for your time, and you guys have a blessed day.